here wanting to talk to you about specific defense. We just got finished talking about non-specific defense systems, and now we're going to speak about specific defense, uh, which we'll call immunity. And immunity would be described or defined as a coordination of T and B cell responses. We have two types of immunity. We have innate immunity and we have acquired immunity. Okay, so again, we were talking about specific resistance or immunity, and this responds to threats that are individualized, not generalized, like we were talking about with nonspecific. So innate immunity is genetically determined. There's no prior exposure to it's not based on prior exposure, and it's not involving antibody production at all. That's just the fact that goldfish will get goldfish diseases. It's a very, um, it's an inborn immunity. Now, acquired, and we won't be really talking about that to any degree, the innate immunity. But now we're going to talk about acquired immunity. This is what we get from being exposed to an antibody, something, some sort of organism or some sort of pathogen. And that will involve, um, again, that's just due to being exposed to it in some form. So we acquire the immunity from exposure to it. So we have two kinds of acquired immunity. We've got active immunity and we have passive immunity. And active immunity is due to antibodies that your body will produce in response to antigens. And there are, again, two types of active immunity. It can be either due to a vaccination, meaning giving the antigen in order to prevent the disease, so that an example would be vaccination, or it could be a naturally acquired immunity, meaning this happens after you actually get the organism, you are exposed to it in the environment, and you make antibodies just from having had the infection. That's active immunity. And then we think about passive immunity. This is due to transferring antibodies from another person to someone. Let's look at the two kinds. There's natural acquired passive immunity, and that means that the mother's antibodies would be transferred across the placenta to the fetus, or it could be given by the mother as she nurses her baby through the breast milk. So that is passive immunity, and that's acquired because the child is acquiring it, the fetus is acquiring it from the mother. Another way, it is called induced passive immunity, and this is when antibodies are actually given by injection to another person to combat an infection. Okay, so this is a useful chart here to try to think about these types of immunity. We'll come back to some of them later. Again, this is just a restatement of that graph. We have active and passive immunity. Okay, so let's go and talk about four general properties of immunity. We have four main properties: specificity, versatility, memory, and tolerance. And I've got a little typo there that I need to fix. There we go. All right, so let's talk at the first one, specificity. This is really stating that your T and B cells, your immune cells, respond to the chemical structure of a specific antigen, only one specific antigen and no others. Your immune system is very specific, and so you have, if you have a T cell or a B cell, they are only going to be reacting to a specific antigen, and therefore there are going to be many, many, many different T and B cells to respond to many antigens. But again, we're saying that these immune cells are very specific. Versatility, or to be versatile. What this is saying is that there are millions of different lymphocyte populations, many different groups or families of lymphocytes that have specific receptors that are very different from one another, and they respond only to a specific antigen. And what we're saying is that the immune system, because of these millions of different populations of lymphocytes, is prepared and able to deal with any antigen at any time. And then this, at any time, then a lymphocyte then would be activated. It's able then to divide into many more lymphocytes to fight the same antigen and can thus form a clone. Okay, so we have a very versatile we have lots of versatility in our immune system. Memory. This means that the response to a second exposure to an antigen is stronger than to the first exposure due to two groups of cells. Those which attack the invader immediately, meaning this is the first group of cells, and those are the guys that do the dirty work, and they get rid of the invader. But some of those will actually stay in the body, and they're called memory cells, and those will remember the antigen for a future exposure. So there is memory as an important feature of the immune system. And then we have tolerance. Tolerance states this, that the immune system will not respond to all antigens. For example, it will tolerate self-antigens, the antigens that it has on its own, the body's own cells and tissues, it will tolerate. That means it will not make antibodies against them. And why does this happen? This happens because, and let me just write down why. This happens because during differentiation in the bone marrow, the development and the processing of the B and T cells during their development and differentiation, then any B or T cells which would exist that could react to any antigens that are normally found in that individual person, in other words, to their self-antigens, are destroyed. This way, the body will not make antibodies against itself, against self cells. So those are the four general properties of immunity, and if you want to go into a little detail and read more about that, you can read in your textbook on that and then ask me any questions. Okay, so let's look at an overview of the immune system and what kind of happens in general. First of all, we have an antigen that will trigger the immune response. An antigen is a foreign substance that usually is a molecule that's sticking up off of the plasma membrane of the organism, and it will trigger an immune response. And what that means is that then phagocytes, or antigen-presenting cells, then are exposed to the antigen. In other words, they run into it, they see it in the bloodstream or in the tissues, and they will engulf it, meaning phagocytize it, and then they will present it or hold it out to other immune cells. Then T cells are activated and will attack the antigen. T cells will then cause activation of B cells, and B cells will mature into plasma cells. Plasma cells produce antibodies, and then antibodies will attack and bind to the antigen. So we see that we have T cells and B cells, and the T cells are the first ones generally activated, and that will then cause the activation of the B cells. So let's investigate this in a little more detail. How do antigens arrive at the lymphatic tissue? We've talked about lymphatic tissue like the spleen and lymph nodes and lymphoid nodules. How do they get there? Well, if antigens enter the bloodstream, they end up traveling through the bloodstream and going through, and they'll travel into the spleen, and they will arrive at T cells and B cells in the spleen. And then they will trigger the immune reaction. If they happen to penetrate the skin and get into the tissues of the skin, they will enter the lymphatic vessels and then travel through the lymphatic vessels into the lymph nodes. If for some reason they're able to cross the mucous membranes of the body, various places where there are mucous membranes, the openings of the body, then they will enter the lymphoid nodules. So this is a nice diagram showing you antigens and how they will, how we have specific to this, that they will trigger the specific defenses. This is called the immune response, and they will trigger the cell-mediated response, which is a direct physical and chemical attack. That's kind of like hand-to-hand combat, I like to think of it. Or it will trigger antibody-mediated immunity, which then will cause production of antibodies. And these are kind of like bullets to attack or neutralize the antigens. So we have hand-to-hand combat, which is what cell-mediated immunity does via the T cells. And then we have the antibody-mediated immunity, which is through the B cells, which will then produce antibodies, which are kind of like bullets that are going to get rid of the antigens. It's kind of just really simplified. Okay, so we have two types of specific immunity. We have cell-mediated immunity, which primarily depends on T cells, but B cells will help. And then we have antibody-mediated immunity, which is primarily B cells, and the T cells will help. All right, I'm going to stop here, and we're going to take up later with cell-mediated immunity. Thanks for listening.